So we are beginning in chapter 1 of our Introduction to Kinesiology textbook written by Hoffman and Knudsen. In this chapter, we will be looking at the topic of physical activity and just exactly what is physical activity. That's probably a term that you have heard often. I'm sure you've used it in conversation with friends and family, but we want to take a deeper dive into what exactly it means in the context of kinesiology. So, what is physical activity? Our textbook talks about physical activity as not all movement is physical activity, but all physical activity is movement. So, what does that mean? How does that even make sense? Not all movement is physical activity, but all physical activity is movement. I think in order to understand that concept, we first need to come up with the definition of movement. So if we look at our textbook on page 6, you will see that the definition that the text gives us is movement consists of a change in the position of one's body parts relative to each other. So essentially, if I am holding my hand straight and then I bend at the elbow, that is movement. That is the changing of the position of my body. So that's the very simple definition for movement. So then the next question that we have to ask was, what is physical activity? Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because in our textbook definition, it is more so talking about physical activity in relation to our in relation to kinesiology and not just general physical activity. So you will notice that I have the words intentional versus unintentional. Now, physical activity, if I scratch my head because I have an itch and I do it without really thinking about it, would that be intentional or unintentional? Right, it'd be unintentional. And if I, wipe away a tear from my eye, again, that is probably something that I do subconsciously, not really thinking about it, just kind of happens, right? So that would be more of that unintentional, but it is physical activity and it is causing movement because, as we said, movement is a change in the body, in the body's position, and both of those things would cause me to change the body's position. So it would be physical activity and it would be movement. So what we're going to talk about as we study kinesiology is more so that intentional movement that is planned and structured and done for a very specific reason. So as we look at that, we're going to talk about the various forms of physical activity that are that intentional movement. So here we go. The first thing that we're going to look at is exercise. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with exercise. I'm sure at some point we've all done some type of exercise. But exercise is something that is intentional. It is planned most of the time. And you actually, set out to do it. So examples of that are training, things that are health related, and cosmetic. So when we're speaking about training, we're talking about things that could be like, athletic training, or it could be military related training, or recreation related performance. That is training. It could be going to the gym and lifting weights. That's resistance training, but it is very intentional and it is planned and it is specific, typically to a goal. So that would be forms of exercise. Next, we have the fundamental movement patterns. And these are just broad categories of human movements. So essentially, what we're talking about here is movements that we all do as humans, that allow us to function. So these are typically broken down into push, pull, squat, hinge, carry. Those are the type of movements that we're doing. And those movements are done every day, sometimes unintentionally. But when we're talking about like exercise and working on those movements specifically, again, that's that intentional work that we're doing. And then finally, We have the sport, which is skilled movement, organizing, game context. So my favorite sport is basketball. Uh, when you're playing basketball, everyone on the team has a goal, and that goal is to win the game, but more specifically, score more points than the other team and stop the other team from scoring points. So that movement is intentional. You are making passes and dribbling and taking shots, all with the intent of scoring baskets. And then you are trying to prevent the other team from scoring baskets by playing defense. So that'd be sliding left to right, jumping up and down, blocking shots. All these things are done with a purpose. And again, that purpose is to prevent the other team from scoring any points and having the chance to win the game. So again, the main takeaway from this short segment is that, almost everything is physical activity, and all physical activity has movement. But for our terms and for our studying, we want to really look at that intentional movement and that intentional physical activity that really has a purpose. The unintentional of wiping the eye or scratching the head, as the examples that I use, those are not the type of physical activity that we want to focus on in relation to kinesiology. So as we continue to go through this semester, you will get much more in-depth examples and ideas about this concept of physical activity and how it directly relates to our study of kinesiology.